Welcome back. FPC Scott continuing our Bible study. We're continuing in the book of Romans. Today we will pick up Romans chapter 2 and verse 17. And it says, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God." The Amplified Bible would say it this way: "But if you bear the name of Jew and rely upon the law and pride yourselves in God and your relationship to Him." So Romans 2 and 17 is part of the passage where Paul is making a case to the Jewish people who live under the law. And the apostle is directing his argument to the Jews, and he is showing them what sins that they were guilty of. Paul has just finished talking about God's judgment for the Gentiles, those people that were not under the requirements of the law of Moses. And now he turns the case he is making to the Jewish people who live under the law, under the Mosaic law. And as we can see in the Amplified Bible, the verse begins an if-then statement. And it continues, and it will be concluded as the passage continues. But an if-then statement says, if you do this, then this will happen. So Paul is describing three specific things that come with being Jewish. First, a person that considers themselves to be a Jew is a member of the nation of Israel, which are God's chosen people. And that goes all the way back to Deuteronomy 7 and 6. It says, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." So it was a high honor to be called a Jew. And so the scripture 2 and 17 begins, "Behold, thou art called a Jew." And from here until the end of chapter 2, the Jews are the main ones that Paul is going to be addressing. And the second thing we find is that the Jews were giving a law that they could rely upon. Even though the law of Moses was a very weighty thing for Israel, it came with a lot of responsibility, it was also a gift. It was the revelation of God's standards for how to live on earth. And this law was given to Israel and no other nation. And the third thing, this person, a Jew who relies on the law, can also boast in God. And so Paul is not describing a selfish bragging, but that the Jewish people could rightly boast that the one true God was their God and that they were his people. And their glory as a people was found in belonging to a glorious God. So Romans 2 and 17 again says, "Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God." So let's look at the scripture in detail. That word "behold." So Paul has stated the general principles on which God would be judging the world. And he has also shown them how they have condemned the Gentiles. And Paul has taken away all of their excuses, all of the excuses that the Jewish people would have. So now Paul is going to start another part of his argument to show how his argument can be applied to the Jews just as he did to the Gentiles in previous verses. And by using the word "behold," he calls their attention to it. It's an important subject. It's something, hey, y'all, look at this. And now Paul is going to address the privileges before he begins to show them how those very privileges can lead to condemnation. A more correct translation than the King James would read, "If now thou art a Jew, thou art called, thou art named Jew," implying that this name was a name of very high honor. And this is the first thing mentioned on which the Jew would likely be to pride himself in, would be the fact that he is called a Jew. The phrase a Jew, this was the name by which the Hebrews were given at that time. And it is clear that they regarded it as a name of honor. The actual name Jew, the origin of that name is not completely clear. There's several different theories. But they were called the children of Israel until the time of Rehoboam. And when the 10 tribes were carried into captivity, but 2 remained, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, the name Jews were evidently given to denote those of the tribe of Judah. And then it was adopted to the rest of the tribes. But that is one of the thoughts of how the term Jew actually came into existence. And restest in the law. The word rest here is evidently used in the sense of trusting in the law or leaning upon the law. So the Jew leaned on or relied on the law for favor from God. They relied on that law. They put their confidence in the fact that God gave it to them and to no one else. They relied on the fact that they had the law, and they relied on their obedience to that law. So it does not mean that they relied on their own works, even though that was true, but it is emphasizing that the Jew leaned on the fact that they had the law and that they were distinguished above all others because they were Jews and because they have been given this law. So the Jews saw themselves as better than other nations because they had that law, they relied upon it, and they rested on that law. And the law here means the entire Mosaic law, all the rules and regulations which Moses had given. It is thought that it may also include the entirety of the Old Testament. The next phrase in that scripture says, "Makest thy boast in God," that they would boast or that they would glory, that they had the knowledge of the true God while other nations were in darkness. So they were bragging about their relationship with God. And because of this, the Jews felt that they were elevated above all the other people. And this is the reason that they despised other nations. It was true that they only had the true knowledge of God, and that God had declared himself to be that God, as we saw in Deuteronomy 4 and 7, which I just read. But we can also see it here again in Psalms 147, 19 and 20. "He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise ye the Lord." So these privileges should have caused a sense of gratitude instead of boasting. And this passage shows us that it is often more common to boast about privileges that we receive rather than to be thankful for the privileges that we've received. The next verse, Romans 2 and 18 says, "And knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law." That verse in the Amplified would read, "And know and understand his will, and discerningly approve the better things and have a sense of what is vital because you are instructed by the law. So now Paul further defines the people that he is talking to. These people do not simply rely on the law of Moses. Through the law, they know God's will, and they use his law as a standard by which to decide if anything is good or if anything is bad. And they can do this because they have been taught Moses' law all of their life. They're very well educated in this, and they can apply it as a standard to the things that they look at and see, does it measure up with Moses' law or not? Is it good or is it bad? And after building up this group, these Jewish people, after Paul has built them up for all of their knowledge and all of their understanding of the law, Paul will actually challenge their actual behavior in the following verses. So the larger point, the main point that Paul is making is about the Jews' misplaced confidence. These people have confidence that God will not judge their sin because they have identified themselves with the law. And this assurance is in the wrong place. And Paul uses this idea to show how the Jewish people are just as guilty as the Gentiles, and that they must be saved by grace, just like everyone else, and not by the law. The next part of that scripture says, and knowest his will. The will or the commands of God. This is knowledge that they obtained from the scriptures. Of course, in this, they were distinguished from other nations. The next part of that scripture says, and approvest. The word used here has two possible interpretations. It can mean either to distinguish or to approve. And the word is also usually applied to the process of testing, or as the scriptures would often refer to as trying metals by fire. So the word is used in a general sense, meaning to try or to distinguish anything. It's to prove its nature or to prove its quality. So when you approve of something, you're actually approving of the quality of it. You're testing it to make sure that it is true and it is pure. And the next phrase in that scripture says, the things that are more excellent. The word translated here, most excellent, means those things that are different than other things. And the reference is to the rites and the customs, the religious ceremonies, the religious customs, the holidays and the feasts and everything that was prescribed by the law of Moses. And the Jew would pride themselves on the fact that they had been taught the law to make these distinctions while the pagan world had been left in ignorance of them. And so this was one of the advantages of which the Jew valued himself and his religion, that they had been instructed about all of these excellent things. And that phrase, being instructed, that is in regard to the one God, his will, and the distinguishing rites of his worship, the ceremonies of their worship. The next verse, Romans 2:19 says, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness. So that same scripture, 2:19 in the Amplified, would say, and if you are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness. So what Paul is showing, all the benefits that a person has received because of receiving the law of God. They know God's will. They can evaluate everything to see what is good, what is bad, what is excellent, what is not. And now Paul adds that they can serve as a guide to the blind and that they can be a light to those in darkness. So God gave his law only to Israel. And at this point, Paul is saying you have an opportunity to show everyone else what was true and who God was. They possessed the light of God's truth that others needed. And he's asking that if all these things are true of the Jewish people, why don't you live according to the law? And this is part of Paul's goal. It's showing that even God's chosen people fall short of his standards of perfection. And so it just further supports Paul's point that all people need to be saved by grace. Scripture goes on and it says, and art confident. So this expression is showing that Paul understands that the Jews thought they were superior in knowledge to all other people. And it's an interesting fact that the Jews put their fullest confidence in their religion. They were proud, they were wicked, they were judgmental, and yet they had the fullest assurance that God was only their God. And Paul goes on to say, a guide of the blind. So that phrase, a guide of the blind, is a figurative expression. It's to mean an instructor of the ignorant. The blind here is referring to the Gentiles because that is how the Jews would have viewed them. So again, Paul's using language that would speak to the Jews and that they would interpret it the way that he knew that they would read into it. And so when Paul is using that word blind or that word ignorant, he knew that the Jews would automatically read that and think of the Gentiles. And the meaning of this portion of Scripture is that the Jews thought so highly of themselves that they felt as they were the only ones that were qualified to instruct the pagan world. That phrase, a light, it's another figurative expression to denote the teacher. And in darkness, it's a common expression to symbolize the ignorance, or in this case, the ignorance of the Gentiles. 1 Peter 2:9 says, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So again, darkness is the ignorance. The light is the knowledge. And then Romans 2:20 says, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. And I'm going to read that verse again in the Amplified. It says, you are a corrector of the foolish. And again, they would have automatically thought foolish, and they think in Gentiles. A teacher of the childish, having in the law of embodiment of knowledge and truth. And so Paul is continuing to build on that if-then statement. If this, then this is going to happen. And the if aspect of this passage is about all of the benefits that come with being an Israelite. Those who are part of God's chosen people and have knowledge of the law of Moses. And so in the Jewish mind, this made Israel the only ones who had received God's ultimate truths. And so this would set a very high standard. And Paul is actually setting his Jewish readers up for some very hard questions that he's going to be asking in the coming scriptures. And Paul now includes the idea that the Jews saw themselves as the instructors of the foolish people who did not have God's law. Of the foolish. So this word foolish is used in the scriptures in two different ways. It can mean to those who are void of understanding, those who do not have understanding, and also to mean those who are wicked. So when Paul is using that word in this scripture, it's to mean that those who do not have the understanding. Paul is not calling them wicked, but he's calling them basically foolish because they do not have an understanding of the law. And that the Jew has qualified himself to be the instructor of those that they consider foolish or those that they consider to have no knowledge. That phrase of babes, the expression is used to mean those people that were as ignorant as children, again, unlearned. And it's an expression which the Jews would very likely apply to the Gentiles at that time, because the Jews considered themselves to be the ones that were qualified to teach the world, which has the form of knowledge. So the word translated here as form is commonly used to mean that something has the appearance of an object. Is what we see with it's what we see without taking into account the internal character. It's only referring to the external figure or the form of the figure. As 2 Timothy 3 and 5 would say, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. So as shown in Timothy, it is also a hypocritical profession of religion. It means the external appearance as opposed to what's going on inside the heart and the mind. It is sometimes used in a good and sometimes it's used in a bad sense. So in the law, in the scripture of the Old Testament is what that would refer to. And in these verses, Paul is telling the Jews all of the claims that they would have. So Paul is agreeing with them. Yes, you have superior knowledge. But he's only doing that so that he can prepare an argument that is going to tell them, if you have this superior knowledge, and you have all these privileges from God, why are you sinning? So that is the end of the if part of the scripture. And the next podcast will get into the then part of the scripture when we pick up in Romans 2 and 21. So that's it for today. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.